Hi everyone, my name is Matt Williams. I am the Access Fellow at Jesus College at the University of Oxford, and I'm also a political scientist, and I'm going to be talking to you today about why politicians don't do more to tackle climate change. So that's the question we've got ahead of us today, and I'll be talking for about 15 minutes. But if you want to get in touch with me afterwards to find out more about this topic or anything else to do with universities, then do feel free to contact me at matthew.williams@jesus.ox.ac.uk. So why don't politicians do more to tackle climate change? Well, let's dive into it. Well, first of all, a little bit of background. Politicians often don't do much about long-term problems because they don't necessarily have the correct resources or the time horizons or the incentives to do something about those very long-term, very intractable problems. So it may be easy to just blame them and say, well, they're fools and they should do more. And if I was in charge, I'd do better. But you need to have a degree of empathy to suggest, actually, this is a really difficult problem. And there are some analogies, there's some other policy spaces where problems have been anticipated sometimes decades in advance, but still it was so difficult to do something about it. So let's take pensions as an example. Old age pensions were provided by the British state just before the First World War. And for decades, people could see that a pensions crisis was coming down the tracks because it's fairly straightforward to notice the country's getting older and older. The working age population is not necessarily going to keep up with that. So the amount of money you have to pay for all of these increasing number of pensioners is going to diminish. So everyone knew that was going to happen. It didn't mean they could do anything about it. It's a bit like sort of like a zombie. You're slowly walking towards the edge of a cliff and you know you shouldn't walk over the cliff, but it's so difficult to know what to do about it because you know it's going to cause so much pain. And as politicians have relatively short time horizons, they're just thinking what's going to happen at the next election. They're not necessarily incentivized to think decades in advance. But tackling climate change is one of those multi-generational problems where they could be punished for trying to do something quite difficult at this time point, even if it might have a benefit way in the future. So that's one of the issues for politicians. Their time horizons are much more circumscribed as a result of democracy. But to be fair, autocrats aren't any better at tackling climate change either. Healthcare and social care are also other examples where it's been spoken about by policy experts for absolutely yonks that there were systematic problems with those policies. And politicians have had good intentions to do something about it. But these problems are so multifaceted, so complex, and changing the system would lead to considerable pain that it's very difficult for them to just turn a switch and suddenly say, oh, look, I'll fix it. So one thing you need to start with is a degree of empathy with politicians, not just dismiss them as charlatans, as fools or knaves, because that's relatively easy, but it's also intellectually lazy, I would say. So let's nonetheless get back to the question and talk about why politicians don't do more to tackle climate change. Well, my first piece of advice, whenever you're confronted with a question, is to unleash your inner toddler. And by that, I mean, pick it apart like an angry toddler asking lots and lots of subsidiary questions. So when I speak to my own toddler, Teddy, he's 3 years old, if we are chatting about something, he'll say, well, why is that? And then when I give him an answer, he'll say, yeah, but why is that? And he'll ask more and more questions, and we'll just start going down this sort of deep rabbit hole of question upon question upon question. But that's very healthy. And in fact, that's the way that you ought to think as well about any of the problems you're confronting in your life. It's a very good mindset, highly perceptive, not credulous. He's not going to take a particular answer at face value. He's going to really interrogate it. And that's the way to think. That so the thinking skills of a toddler is basically the same as the thinking skills of an Oxford student and academic. So let's unleash our toddler. I'll show you what I mean specifically. If we deconstruct the question, we need to think like a toddler would think. Well, so first of all, have politicians failed to tackle climate change? Is that in fact an accurate statement? Do they not tackle climate change? Is the underlying assumption of this question in any sense reasonable? So that might be the first sort of level of a toddler deconstructive analysis of the question. But we can go even deeper than that. Which politicians are we talking about here? Is it the specific members who form the executive branch? In other words, those who govern the country? Or are we talking about lawmakers, legislators? Are they also partly contributing? But then you can go even deeper than that. What are politicians? Are politicians just a sort of reflection of public mood? Are they essentially like a sort of a puppet that we are manipulating, the voters, and therefore whatever they're thinking and doing is merely reflective of our own inadequacies as citizens? So when we say politicians are not tackling climate change, do we really mean, really, that we are not tackling climate change sufficiently? You know, why do we have politicians? They are there to take the difficult decisions that communally we would fail to. So we've delegated responsibility to them to take difficult decisions. But it seems on this particular matter, we punish them when they take quite difficult decisions, because then we might vote them out of office. Now, of course, you could argue that actually there is a systematic distance between politicians and the people that they represent, because there may be a sort of elitism in politics, such that political representatives are elite and they're sort of far removed from the general population, and therefore they don't represent us terribly well. But you need to have a really good think about when you say something like politicians don't do enough for climate change. Well, that could be because the population don't want to do enough about climate change, really. Okay, but and again, the toddler can go even further in his or her interrogation of this question. So when we say, why don't politicians do more, what do we mean? Do more than whom? Do more about what? How can you compare? If you say, why don't you do more, you have in mind some sort of yardstick about what ought to be done. But if that yardstick is left unuttered, then how can you possibly know what it means to do more? What sort of metrics of active and inactive tackling of climate change might we use? Well, here's a study from the University of Yale, which describes the top 10 best and the top 10 worst countries with regards to tackling climate change. Now, this is probably going to be largely intuitive insofar as there are Scandinavian countries at the top of the pile and some poorer developing countries at the bottom of the pile. You might be somewhat surprised to see the United States of America in the top 10, but they actually plow a lot of investment into climate change. But again, this gets to the point of, well, how have you put this table together? How do you measure activity when it comes to climate change? Is it the amount of money invested in green technologies that will pay off in the future? Is it the amount of carbon offsetting done? Well, of course, the problem with carbon offsetting is that you're basically still contributing to climate change, but you're offsetting it to another country to deal with. So you might manufacture dirty things in another country, you still import the products, so you're still basically the cause of the climate change, it's just not in your territory. That's what a lot of countries do. So you've got to be very careful with how you sort of blithely say, oh, well, we should do more, we should be more like Denmark. Well, maybe we should, but you've got to be careful with those sorts of statements. Anyway, let's get to actually trying to answer this question and start with the political economy of climate change. So when we say politicians don't do enough about climate change, well, we need to start with thinking about what are the costs and what are the benefits about tackling climate change. And we can start with just the essential point of material costs. So one of the fairly classic reasons why politicians haven't historically engaged with climate change is because it was expensive to do so. The technologies were not cheap. There was insufficient labor force training in how to utilize those technologies. And so the cost of utilizing cleaner energy and renewable energy was outweighed the benefits that were seen to be accruing, especially as the benefits were so long in the distance. The benefits might be something like, we do this so as not to face apocalypse in sort of 50 years' time. It's very difficult for a politician to do that sort of calculation. But this digs deeper. So when we talk about the costs and the benefits, we need to really grapple with what the costs mean on an individual and a collective basis. So let's start with individual rationality. Why do particular individuals on a micro level choose to or not to do anything about climate change? Well, this could be enlightened with some consideration of game theory. Game theory is a study in maths and economics which looks about how people behave as if they're playing a game. And a very famous example of this is the prisoner's dilemma. Do two prisoners who've been accused of conspiracy in a crime snitch on each other or cooperate with each other? If you set up the incentives in a certain way, such that the two prisoners can't communicate with each other, the likelihood is that the most rational thing will be for them both to defect and both snitch on each other. And quite often, the way that societies work has a similar problem, is that we don't have the institutions that can help us pool our shared interests. And so we tend to just defect. In other words, we tend to punish each other. So rather than cooperating, we defect. And another similar game theory comes from the tragedy of the commons, which is this idea that if you have common resources that everyone has access to, like the oceans, like pasture land that could be common land, people will just exploit it. And if you're the only one mug that doesn't exploit it, you'll just lose out. Your family will go hungry. Everyone else will spoil the resource. They'll deplete it. And you'll just have been wearing a hair shirt. And that's a stupid thing to do. So, I mean, obviously it's not literally a stupid thing to do, but the point of game theory is that if you're the one person that through ideology or good intentions refuses to exploit the situation, then you punish yourself. And that's part of the problem with individual rationality, and why often individuals don't do more to tackle climate change, because they would be hurting themselves for the sake of everyone else. And so when we extrapolate from the individual to the collective, in other words, from you and me to the whole of society and groups, you get a problem of collective action. Why don't more groups of people do more to tackle climate change? And again, if we talk about costs and benefits, it can really help us understand this. Part of the problem with tackling climate change is that the costs are very concentrated, but the benefits are highly diffuse. Imagine you and a group of friends go to a beach and you tidy it up and you clean the local environment. You have borne that cost yourselves. You've had to take the time and effort to do that, but everyone benefits from a cleaner beach. So the costs are concentrated, the benefits are dispersed. So what in fact is your incentive to clean the beach? Many would argue you were foolish to do so, because I'm going to enjoy the cleaner beach and you've taken the time to go out and do it, you mug. Now, of course, you might take other benefits from it. You might think, well, I feel good about cleaning the beach, and who cares if other people benefit? That's fine. But, economists don't necessarily think in this way. So conversely, those sort of companies that make a lot of money by exploiting fossil fuels, they have highly dispersed costs and very concentrated benefits. So, for example, if a company wants to start fracking for oil in parts of Lancashire, the costs of that activity will be highly dispersed. In other words, they'll make the environment a little bit more dirty, but it will be a little bit more dirty for everyone. So it's very difficult to find people that are going to be that easily displeased by it. I mean, you'll find some, but they'll be so widely dispersed it won't cause a huge trouble for you. And the benefits in terms of making money are all concentrated in that company. So they're highly incentivized to act together and exploit that fracking opportunity, whereas other groups are not incentivized to do something to clean it up again. So that's one of the arguments, especially from economists, as to why more isn't done in order to tackle climate change. Another crucial issue that I've raised several times now is discounting the future. When it comes to climate change, we're talking about a multi-generational, multifaceted problem. And so we need to try and work out how you can solve such a problem by discounting present benefits for future gains. And those future gains are indeterminate. So it could even be that by wearing a hair shirt and doing lots of climate mitigation work now, what we predict as the worst case scenario won't come to pass. But then, of course, that can reinforce the arguments of some deniers that, well, it was never going to happen in the first place. So you've got to have this awkward and difficult conversation along the lines of, we need to basically make our lives a little less comfortable now so that our children and our grandchildren won't face absolute existential peril. And that's very difficult. And it's very easy for individual countries or individual units to defect, just like the prisoners in the prisoner's dilemma, just like the tragedy of the commons, just like the logic of collective action. It just takes one United States of America to say, we're not going to bother with that. We don't want to bear this burden. You do it, fine. And we'll benefit from it because you'll be cleaning up all the environment for us. You can't exclude us from that benefit, but we're not going to do it. We're not fools. So it's very difficult to obtain that degree of consensus. And it's also, there's a questions about intergenerational justice. If we're working this hard on our grandchildren's behalf, well, what do we get out of that, except for a slightly sort of morally superior air about ourselves? So there are questions about justice as well. So if we go back to the question and we ask, why don't politicians do more to tackle climate change? Well, first of all, it's a really difficult problem. It's multifaceted and multi-generational. There are lots of reasons why engaging in climate change might be seen as self-defeating and self-punishing. Actually, that's becoming less true because the technology is becoming cheaper and cheaper. So as of 2016, for example, solar power became cheaper than exploiting fossil fuels for developing electricity. And this is a game changer. This is going to change the calculations because all of a sudden you're a mug if you don't use renewable energies. Now it's the cheapest way forward. So things could really shift very quickly as a result of that shift in emphasis. But anyway, what might you do differently? If you were Prime Minister for a day, what sort of things might you do in order to really shift our minds on this? Will you change the narrative? Will you change the ideology? Will you change the institutions? Will you change the money and move the money around? What would you do differently? It's always easy to say, if only I was in charge, it would be better, but be specific. What concretely would you do? Thank you so much for watching. I hope this has been interesting, and I hope to see you all soon. Thanks so much. Bye.
Helo, Lucas Watts dwi. Fi yn astudio Gwleidyddiaeth, Economeg ac Athroniaeth. Trefn anghywir fan'na. Anyway, yng Ngholeg Bodym, Rydych hon, fan hyn. Cyn hynny, es i ysgol gartholwg, Henreglwys, jyst ger Pontypridd, ble astudiais i'r gyfer lefel A, hanes, Saesneg a mathemateg, a wedyn ar gyfer AS nes i Cemeg a math pellach. Bron anghofio hwnna. Fi na'r rhywbeth blwyddyn yma, a fi'n credu fi jyst mynd i roi bach o menolog i chi o be mae fel astudio PB yma, a just fi'n gwybod be mae bywyd fi fel. Strwythur y cwrs, basically. So chi'n dechrau a chi'n neud y tri ffwnc. Maen nhw'n neud e o fel safle o fel dim gwybodeth flaenorol, sy'n neis, achos ni'n poeni cyn tro lan, ni fel, fi roed i astudio rhain o blaen, ydyn nhw'n disgwyl i fi fel troi lan yn gwybod loads am Gwleidyddiaeth, am Athroniaeth, ond dyn nhw rili ddim. Mae wedi cynllunio fel pawb yn cael fel troi lan, fel fi just, mae diddordeb fi yn hon, a fi eisiau dysgu mwy, a dyna'r unig fel prerequisite. So mae'n sicrhau wedyn, yma fel y blwyddyn cyntaf, just pwrpas y blwyddyn cyntaf i sicrhau bod pawb ar fel yr un lefel yn mynd mewn i'r ail flwyddyn, fel bod chi'n gallu gwneud fel y pethau dyfnach, pethau mwy diddorol. Mae yna tair arholiad ar diwedd y blwyddyn cyntaf, un ym mhob pwnc, a mae rhaid chi pasio nhw er mwyn cario ymlaen i'r cwrs. Mae hynny'n swnio lot mwy frifwchus nag yw e. Mae pawb yn pasio, basically. Mi'n credu mae fel 1 neu 2 yn methu pob blwyddyn, ond wedyn maen nhw'n oleisedd a maen nhw bron pob tro'n pasio. Os chi jyst yn neud y gwaith, chi cario ymlaen, dyw e ddim fel rhywbeth i poeni amdano. A wedyn pan chi'n symud mewn i'r ail flwyddyn, chi'n cael gollwng 1 o'r 3 ffwnc. Nes i gollwng Economeg. Ond mae rhai pobl yn cario ymlaen ar 3. Dwi'n rili'n deall pam, ond maen nhw'n neud e a maen nhw'n mwynhau. So os chi fel ddim eisiau gollwng chi'n gallu cario ymlaen. Ond hefyd o fewn y pwnciau hunain, mae yna llwyth o opsiynau. Ac so chi'n gallu fel dylunio'r cwrs i'ch diddordebau chi. Mae yna fi'n credu 20 opsiwn gwleidyddiaeth, 20 yn Athroniaeth, a wedyn 10 yn Economeg fi'n credu. Sy'n ar fi yn neud opsiynau hollol gwahanol i fel ffrindiau fi sydd hefyd yn neud PB. Fi'n credu mae fel, mae yna cwbl ohono ni, dyn ni ddim yn rhannu unrhyw fydwylo o gwbl. So mae yn hyblyg iawn. Chi rili yn cael dylunio fe fel chi'n gallu osgoi'r pethau chi ddim yn hoffi, Economeg, ac yn gallu parhau wneud y pethau chi rili yn mwynhau. So fi'n ar yn bennaf yn neud Athroniaeth a chymdeithaseg, a chi'n gallu neud pethau cymdeithaseg o fewn gwleidyddiaeth. Na siarad bach yn fwy am hynny nawr. Ond fi just, nes i ddim rili mwynhau cymaint y pethau fel, y byd go iawn, basically. So fi'n ar yn neud lot o bethau damcaniaethol yn bennaf. So yn dechrau da Athroniaeth, so dechrau nes i foeseg, sef pethau fel beth sy'n iawn, beth yw'n golygu rhywbeth fod yn iawn. Classic philosophy, basically. Cwestiynau fel sut dylwn ni farnu os mae bywyd rhywun yn mynd yn dda iddyn nhw, pethau fel hynny. Wedyn nes i pethau bach mwy funky, bach mwy wallgof, hapu'r metaphyseg ac epistemoleg fi, lle ni sgwennu trythodau os yw amser yn bodoli, os ydy'r byd jyst yn bodoli fel o fewn fy ymenydd, a does dim gwrthrychau yna yn y byd. Eto fel Athroniaeth clasurol. Hefyd fi'n credu bach mwy off-piste nes i papur aesthetig, sef Athroniaeth celf, lle ysgrifennu trythodau ar fel beth yw celf, sut mae cerddoriaeth yn mynegu emosiwn. Nes i hefyd sgwennu traethad, un o hoff trythodau fi ar set stand-up Eddie Murphy. Nes i rili casau, a just be ni'n meddwl oedd hynny'n dweud wrthyn ni yn athronyddol, sy'n eisiau mwynhau hynny. A hefyd na'r tymor yma fi'n astudio Athroniaeth Indiaidd, yn edrych ar y syniadau hynny i gyd fi newydd sôn amdani basically, ond mewn bwdaeth a hindwaith sydd wedi bod rili ddiddorol. Mae Athroniaeth yn pwnc hwyl iawn, fi'n credu. Os chi'n hoffi fel dadleuon cysyniadol, hynny fi'n credu yn amlwg newch chi mwynhau Athroniaeth. Fi'n credu bod pawb yn deall bod Athroniaeth fel, fi'n gwybod, jyst istedd yna pendroni, a mae hynny bach yn wir am y cwrs yma. Mae lot o fel darllen, a fi'n credu fel y ffordd gorau i wneud yn dda yn Athroniaeth yma, just literally istedd yna a meddwl sy'n hilarious. Ond mae hefyd yn dysgu chi jyst i fel ysgrifennu mewn ffordd fel manwl a ffordd resymegol iawn, sef, chbo, semi-pwynt y cwrs. Dyna pwynt y pwnc. Athroniaeth really, jyst bod chi'n gallu ysgrifennu mewn ffordd fel resymegol iawn, mewn ffordd mae pobl yn gallu fel deall sut chi'n mynegu fel syniadau abstract iawn yma. A fi'n credu fyna hefyd, werth pwyntio allan bod fel hynny efallai yn ymddangos fel amrywiaeth bach rhyfedd o bynciau. Fi'n credu pan mae pobl yn meddwl am PP, dyn nhw ddim yn meddwl am pobl yn meddwl, yn ysgrifennu trythodau ar Eddie Murphy yn y bôn. Ac eto, fi'n just yn mynd yn ôl fel at yr hyblygrwydd hynny, a'r ffordd bod fel y cwrs really yn gadael chi wneud y pethau chi eisiau wneud a ysgor pethau chi ddim. So, mewn gwleidyddiaeth, nes i cymdeithasau gwleidyddol. So, cwestiynau ffili clasic fel sut mae hunaniaeth dosbarth yn effeithio ar gwleidyddiaeth chi, beth yw cenedlaetholdeb, a sut mae hynny yn dod i ffodoli, cwestiynau ar gwahanol mathau bŵer, a sut ni'n gallu wrth ymchwilio mewn i'r gwahanol mathau bŵer yma. Wedyn nes i theori gwleidyddol, ble ni'n gofyn cwestiynau ar fel beth yw cyfiawnder, hefyd yn edrych ar fel critical race theory a feministiaeth. Cwestiynau fel ydy beth yn iawn ymateb i anghyfiawnder gyda thrais, fel ffurf o ffilm protest. A na nes i theori cymdeithasol, mwy o theori, lle wnaethon ni treulio un tutorial yn siarad am fideo o'r dau boi yma yn ymladd tu allan i dafarn, fi'n credu Margate yn rhywbeth, a ystyried beth hynny yn dweud wrthyn ni am fel rhyngweithio fel gwyneb i gwyneb yn cymdeithasol, a sut mae hynny fel yn torri lawr a effeithio pan mae fel rhyngweithio cymdeithasol jyst yn fel torri lawr. Hefyd stuff ar fel sut mae social norms yn dod i fodoli, sut maen nhw'n diflannu, pethau fel hynny. Nes i rili mwynhau hynny. A na'r tymor yma fi'n gwneud gwleidyddiaeth yn Ne Asia, so yn edrych ar gwleidyddiaeth yn India, Pakistan, Bangladesh a Sri Lanka. Fi'n credu'r treithad fi wythnos diwetha ar amgylchedd yn India, sut mae pobl yn dod i fel poeni am yr amgylchedd yn y bôn. A fi'n credu wythnos nesaf, ni'n edrych ar gwleidyddiaeth arfau nuclear rhwng India a Pakistan, feddwl diddorol fi'n credu. Mae hefyd fel, mae'r papurau gwleidyddiaeth yn lle X, mae yna lot o reini ar gael, chi lle fel gwleidyddiaeth yn China, yn Russia, yn Africa, Africa, Sub-Saharan fi'n credu, ond mae yna basically mwyafrif o lefydd yn y byd, chi'n gallu gwneud gwleidyddiaeth y lle yna. So, o rhan fel wythnos arferol, mae'n anodd ddweud be mae wythnos arferol yn edrych fel, achos mae'n just bach yn hectic, a mae'n newid lot. Ond fi'n credu mae gen I fel 4 i 7 darlith yr wythnos fi'n credu. Fi'n mynd i'r rhan fwyaf o'r rheini, ond prif fel craidd y cwrs yw darllen, a wythnos i beth sy'n gweithio, mae tutorial yn anfon fi 2 rhestr darllen a 2 cwestiwn traethad yr wythnos, un ar gyfer pob modiwl fi'n neud y tymor hynny, a dwi'n ysgrifennu'r 2 traethawd wneud y darllen i gyd, a wedyn yn mynd i tutorial, a tutorials yn really craidd y dysgu yma yn rhy dechrau. Chi'n mynd mewn a chi'n cael sgwrs basically gyda fel arbenigwr yn pwnciau diddorol a pwnciau chi wedi dewis, a chi'n neud, mae'r sgwrs hynny, mae weithiau fi'n credu 1 neu 2 arall, fel myfyrwyr arall, dych chi fyna, a chi basically'n sgwrs am treithad chi, a just fi'n gweld y topic yn fwy cyffredinol. So fi'n credu ar gyfer pob treithad fi'n darllen efallai fel, mae'r cymryd probably rhywbeth fel 100 tudalen fi'n credu, ond weithiau lot fwy, a weithiau bach yn llai, ond fi'n credu tua 100 tudalen. Efallai bod hynny'n swnio fel lot, a mae fe'n teimlo fel lot weithiau, ond chi'n gallu ffito pethau arall mewn, a mae yna ffordd o ffindo chi bwysydd. Fel llynedd, ni'n ffito mewn 2 game bildroed yr wythnos, yn ogystal â fel 2 awr o wersi Rwsieg, a ni hefyd yn mynd allan fel 2 waith 4 gwaith yr wythnos hefyd, so dwi ddim fel 3 blwyddyn yn y llyfrgell. A hefyd mae'r ffaith bod chi fel yn neud cymaint o waith ac yn sgwennu cymaint o drydiaethodau, yn meddwl bod chi'n cael ymarfer hynny lot, a chi yn gwella, a chi gallu teimlo chi'n yn gwella lot. A mae lot o feedback hefyd, feedback ar fel 2 treithad yr wythnos, mae hynny'n lot. So mae fe yn teimlo bach mwy fel, mae'n teimlo fel value for money weithiau, yn herma fel, fi'n cael, I don't know, dwi'n teimlo fel bod fi wedi gwella lot, bod wedi bod yn, fi'n gwybod, straen enfawr yng nghyfnodau. Mae'r cyfan rwy ben blwyddyn yma, sy'n bach yn drist, really, achos fi wedi rili mwynhau. So mae diwedd y blwyddyn yma, mae 8 arholiad dy fi, a just dyna sy'n penderfynu y graf. So ddim arholiad dy fi blwyddyn diwetha, roedd hynny ddelfrydol, honestly, lot yn well, achos dwi'n meddwl bod fel tamor olaf hynny yn yr haf, os dydd corona ddim wedi bodoli, just mor neis, achos mae'n mor chill. A mae'n meddwl bod fel chi'n cyrraedd, pam chi'n istedd ar arholiadau i gyd, chi fel at your peak sort of thing. Ond, chi fel, if that's my thing, a chi eisiau asesiad mwy cyson efallai, a gwasgaru fel asesiad ffurfiol allan, meddyliwch am hynny wrth wneud y cais, ond mae yn iawn, dwi ddim rili di effeithio ar profiad fi yma cymaint. Beth arall fi dweud? Fi'n credu just, os chi on nawr, os chi'n poeni bod chi on nawr meddwl am wneud cais, really pidwch poeni, nes i penderfynu wneud cais gyfer fi'n credu fel 3 wythnos, 4 wythnos cyn y deadline. Mae hefyd werth just edrych ar wefan y brifysgol am y cwrs. A hefyd, fi'n credu peth gorau yw just fel edrych ar YouTube neu fel ffind y llyfr neu podcast ar fel un o'r pynciau, rhannau o'r pynciau chi'n meddwl yn diddorol. Just fel cael look, a os chi'n mwynhau hynny, byddwch chi probably mwynhau yma yn neud PB. Fi'n credu dyna fe o fi. Ond fi wedi rili mwynhau, a fi'n credu os ydych chi'n ystyried wneud cais, just newch chi, beth yw peth gweitha sy'n gallu digwydd. Fi'n credu dyna fe. Syna'r fi'n credu na amwch chi nôl i'r gwesteiwr, bydd bynnag maen nhw yn cyberspace.
Nawr cofiwch y bydd y dosbarthiadau meistr yna ar gof a chadw i chi eto. Over the last 2 days, you've had the opportunity to attend 4 different masterclasses. But if you wish to see more, the series of masterclass content will be available to you to view after the conference is finished. Gobeithio chi gael rhagflas buddiol am y pynciau amrywiol. The conference has hopefully helped give you a feel for what it might be like to study the different subjects at university level. Amser I fyfyrio eto nawr. It's now time to use the next 15 minutes to reflect on all the masterclasses you've seen over the 2 days and build on the masterclass reflection resources you used yesterday. Os mae heddi chi'n ymuno â ni, if you're just joining us today, these will have been sent to you previously or can be downloaded in the lobby area. Ac felly, ewch i'r lobby i'w lawrlwytho. Reflect upon which masterclass you enjoyed most. Beth sy'n mynd â'ch bryd? Which big ideas and research would you like to be a part of investigating when you go to university? Yna, nôl i'r brif stafell i wybod mwy am heno. I'll see you back in the main room at 3:35 for some final instructions before this evening.